So I'm going to talk to you about anxiety in children and in adolescents tonight. And clearly, you guys think it's important to come and find out about how to help our kids who get anxious and how to help ourselves when we're anxious. So I won't spend a lot of time convincing you why it's important. The obvious reason is that when anxiety gets to a heightened level, it can get in the way of kids' abilities to participate in normal activities that are good for them. And anxiety gets in the way of us as adults and our ability to do the things we want to do. So what we often see and what makes anxiety get in the way is that we tend to avoid. So anxiety makes us want to avoid the situation or the things or the people that are making us anxious. And that's how we end up not getting to participate in things. So as parents, I'm sure if you're parenting an anxious child, you know that you'll hear from them that they don't want to do things because they're anxious. Or if they're little children, they'll maybe talk about having a sick stomach or stomach pains or a headache. And that's how we hear about their anxiety. It comes out in those kind of physical complaints. So another example is school phobia that we talk about, so avoidance of school. And there's a real difference between anxiety and avoidance of school and truancy and avoiding school. So a key point to remember is the motivator and the payoff for school phobia versus truancy. Oftentimes we see with kids who are truant that they're doing other fun things when they're not at school. We see anxious kids as being miserable and missing things, but not being able to go to school. So anxious people make up about 10% of our population, so that's a lot of people, and it probably accounts for why every year people are interested in hearing about it, because there are a lot of anxious people. And we do know that we can identify kids as young as 2 or 3 years of age as being more likely to develop a significant problem with anxiety as they grow older, unless we intervene to do something about supporting that temperament and helping them to learn some strategies as they age. We also know that anxious kids are not the first anxious person in their family. So there's a real biological and genetic component to anxiety disorders, which means that if you're an anxious parent, then you're more likely to produce anxious children. That certainly has been true in my life, and if I look back in my family history, there are a lot of anxious people in our family, so it's no big surprise that anxiety is present in the current generation as well. So what that means is that if we help our children as we start to see those anxious symptoms, then what we're doing is we're not taking away their temperament, and we can't mean that they're not going to be sensitive people, but we can certainly teach them skills that they can use that will help them to manage their anxiety such that it doesn't get in the way and they can go on about their business. So if we use, I'm always throwing myself under the bus, although my daughter this year, who's 28, said, you can use me as examples, Mom. But for somebody like me who is anxious by nature, speaking to a group of people is an anxiety-provoking situation, but I can't avoid doing it, right? I have to keep pushing myself to do it. I'm an anxious person. I do have one phobia, and that is flying. And that is something I avoid badly because I know the more I avoid it, when I do have to fly, the more terrified I am. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. One of the experts in the field talks about it as being riding the worry hill, right? That you have to keep on riding up that hill towards the thing that's making you anxious. Because if you don't, the next time you're in that situation, the hill is Mount Everest. So of those people that are anxious, about 2% will end up with severe anxiety. And that's that anxiety that we talk about that really does interfere with normal day-to-day functioning. So I'm going to present tonight in the format that I would suggest that if you have a child with a significant anxiety problem, you should kind of cover all this information for them as you're trying over the course of their school years to support them as they cope with anxiety. So one of the main wonderful web pages that you could write down and would mean probably you'd never need to come see me ever again is called Anxiety BC. So ABC, and BC stands for British Columbia. The government spent a lot of money about 3 or 4 years ago and hired experts, both in the field of anxiety treatment, but also in the field of interaction online. So it's a really good site and will help parents and kids themselves to learn to manage their anxiety in a variety of different ways. And one of the things they tell you is that you need to do what's called in my field psychoed. So what you have to do is educate the anxious person about their anxiety, because in doing that, you're really taking away a lot of the power of that anxiety. The person can end up feeling quite crazy if they're very, very anxious. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm sure in this audience there are people who have severe anxiety or who have someone in their family with severe anxiety. And anxiety of that nature isn't the kind of worry-warty kind of person. When you get extremely anxious, your thinking gets very, very distorted, very, very confused, and we'll see kids not making sense. And they know they're not making sense. The anxious person knows that, but feels at the time that there's nothing they can do about it. So that's why it's important for them to understand what anxiety is doing to them and to understand some strategies to use. So what we tell people is that it's normal to be anxious. So we've all been anxious about certain kinds of situations, and anxiety is temporary, it's going to go away, and yes, it's going to feel terrible, but it'll time limit itself. So for example, it's normal to be anxious the first day of a job. It's normal to be anxious the first day of high school, the first day of school, the first day of daycare, the first day with a new teacher or a new boss. Going on a date with somebody makes people anxious always. So it's important to kind of explain that anxiety is uncomfortable, normal, and temporary. Those are key messages for kids to get about those really uncomfortable feelings. The other thing for kids to understand is that sometimes it's really quite adaptive. It's quite effective in terms of your coping to feel some anxiety. So I've been sick with that flu for about 7 weeks. And so I've been kind of dragging myself through my days with not a lot of energy. But tonight when I knew I had to come and do this, I get an adrenaline rush, I get anxious, and it gives me some energy. So tonight I was sitting like a lump after supper at home, and my husband was saying, "It's 6:20. It's 6:25. He was anxious because he was thinking, I know you're usually asleep by 8:30 because you're so sick all the time. Please, could you start to gear up and look like you're going to pay attention tonight? And I was thinking, you don't need to worry about it because as soon as I get in the car, I'm going to go, whoa, I've got to go and talk. So anxiety can be adaptive. It's that fight-flight reaction, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever been like coming home at night in the dark after you've been out with friends and you have to walk a distance from, when I was a young person, it was from the bus stop to my apartment. If somebody starts following you behind, you move mighty darn fast, right? You've got that immediate reaction. So, as we said, anxiety becomes a problem when you react that way and there isn't any real danger. So, for kids who can't tackle normal activities, they can't do a sleepover, they can't go with their friends to a birthday party that's a sleepover, because the level of anxiety they're going to experience at being separate from parent or family or their home or their own bed is out of proportion to any real danger that's associated with it, and it starts to get in the way. There are all sorts of types of anxiety disorders, and children and adolescents get them and can be diagnosed with them the same as us adults can. And I won't spend a huge amount of time on each of them because there's a lot of strategies that I want to focus our energies on. But generalized anxiety disorder is just those people that are anxious in almost every situation. So there's something they could worry about, feel stressed about in almost any life situation. And they're going to seek constant reassurance. So they're the kid that wants you to say, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. No, it's all right, we're safe. Nothing bad's going to happen. The teacher will like you. Your friends will be good to you. You'll do okay. It's that constant reassurance seeking. Social anxiety is much more common in adolescents than it is in younger children, but it's exactly what we all know it to be, which is that avoidance of social situations because those are the feared situations. So I work with a woman who would be quintessentially not socially anxious. For her, if she's had a hard day at work and has been stressed by work, she wants to go out and be with people because people are not stressful for her. She doesn't get socially anxious, and indeed, they're a distraction for her. So they take her brain off of her stresses and put them on things that she really enjoys. Whereas for someone like me, for whom social interactions are more likely to be anxiety-provoking, the last thing I'm going to do is place myself in that situation because I'm more likely to be stressed and anxious. We're all familiar with kids who present with separation disorder, and this is diagnosed when it persists into middle childhood and into adolescence. So we know it's normal for kids to make strange at points in time in infancy and early toddlerdom, and it's normal for them to have difficulty separating. Sometimes they go through phases where they only want one parent, right? And they don't want to go to their dad or to their mom. However, when it persists into that school age, middle childhood and on, it becomes a significant problem for kids. Then there's the typical phobias that kids will experience. So kids that are creeped out by bees or bugs of various kinds or spiders or those kinds of things. Kids that can't have a medical injection because they're terrified of needles. And then kids can experience panic attacks, the same as adults can. Panic attacks feel like you really are going to die, and they do feel like you're going to go crazy. So we need to work really hard for those people in terms of helping them to learn how to calm their brains, calm their bodies. And then obsessive-compulsive disorder is a kind of anxiety disorder, and I think we won't spend any time on that because it's too complicated. So here's what we know about anxiety, that anxiety affects kids of all ages, teenagers as well, and adults in 3 ways. So it impacts how you think about a situation, and that's the worrying that we talk about, the what ifs. What if something bad happens at home if I'm gone from home? What if something goes wrong for me when I get to school today and I fall and I look like a fool and then everybody laughs at me? It's that what if thinking. Sometimes we call that catastrophizing. If something small bad happened before, it's bound to happen again. And then the physical feelings that are associated with anxiety, and that's, kids have a variety of different physical symptoms, but stomach aches, sick stomachs, headaches, tension, those kinds of things. Heart racing, sometimes kids will feel dizzy, short of breath. And then the behaviors we do when we experience those thoughts and feelings. So with anxiety, what we really do is try to get the heck out of there. We try to escape or avoid altogether. And what we find is once that pattern starts operating, the strength of the avoidance response gets much, much stronger. So what we often say to parents, what we always say to parents with an anxious child is, do your level best never to let the person avoid. So you start thinking it's easier if you just don't go to school today because the uproar is so terrible that we're experiencing in the morning, and maybe you really are sick. Once that pattern starts, it gets very, very difficult to get the child to do the thing that they're now deciding is so terrifying to them. And it can feel like you're being really mean making the child do this. But what we need people to understand is that the mechanism of the biology of anxiety is such that if you avoid it, it will be worse the next time round. The closest example I can have for people who've never felt severely anxious is like if you're really scared of the dentist, like you're going to have a root canal on Monday, and you spend the whole weekend thinking, oh, dear God, I don't know how I can do it, and you're so scared, and your heart is racing, and you just can't sleep on Sunday night, and then you get up Monday morning, and all you can think about is, what excuse can I come up with that would allow me to get the heck out of this situation and cancel the appointment? And if you're me, you're thinking, but I can't because it's irresponsible, and plus they'll charge me, and then I have to see that person again. But then if the phone rings and it's the dental office saying that the dentist has the stomach flu and they have to cancel you, that flood of relief is what kids experience when their anxiety wants them to avoid a specific thing. So for us at Maryvale, we'll have kids that come into our specialized day treatment program for anxious kids, and Regional Children's Center also has that program. For them, they can be sure they're going to be able to go to school the night before even. They're committed, they've practiced their coping strategies, but when they're greeted by that school bus in the morning, they can't get on the bus. And parents really want to pull their hair out, is what they want to do, because they've thought they've made it, and then now they haven't, and what do I do? So we've talked about the physical signs of anxiety, and the role of the parent when you're looking at these physical signs of anxiety is educating your child that these really are symptoms of anxiety. Because if you think about it from the point of view of a person who's 7, 8, 9, 10, you can think, well, I must be sick. Like, we've got to go to the doctor here. All these things are happening to me. Normally, you would just think we need to race right off to the pediatrician, and instead you're asking me to do relaxation and keep going, right? So you need to educate your child about these are legitimate feelings. You really feel this way, but it's anxiety. And then you have to do some work educating your child around how those thoughts and feelings interact. And mostly kids don't have that down at the beginning. Oftentimes adults don't. If you really tried to think about, I'm feeling strongly some strong emotion, and somebody asked you to think, what were the thoughts that were going on in your head associated with those feelings? Oftentimes you couldn't tell them. But we need to get good at figuring them out, because it helps the person to know when they need to start practicing some coping strategies, even substituting some different thoughts, talking to themselves in their heads differently. So it's a good example, and this is from one of the experts in the field, a woman named Doreen Wagner, who has some really good parent manuals as well. So she's saying, if you think you hear a noise outside the house at night and you think it's a burglar, you're going to feel really scared, right? But if you think to yourself, it's just the trees against the window, you might be annoyed because they're bothering you, but you're not going to be scared. So that's the concept. So worried thoughts include these sorts of things. And this is kids' worried thoughts, but we can do the adult version of them quite easily as well. So, worried that they're going to be laughed at, worried that they're going to be picked on, worried that they won't be chosen for something at school, worried that they'll mess up a presentation or that they'll not do well in a test, worried oftentimes that they're going to throw up. That's a common one for little kids. I'm going to throw up at school, and then what'll happen? It'll be so horrible. This is another example of how thoughts connect to feelings, and it's the pilot and co-pilot. The co-pilot is saying, the fuel light's on, Frank, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. You can see the passengers and then it says, wait, oh, my mistake, that's the intercom light. So it's the concept being, depending on how you're interpreting it, your feelings will go similarly. So behaviors we've talked about. So what you're going to see is this avoidant behavior. And avoidance can look really like straightforward avoidance, and that's almost easier for us as parents. So I don't want to go to school today. I've got a sick stomach. I might throw up. I don't want to go and eat in the cafeteria. I don't like the food. Really, that's the reason. No, that's not the reason, right? It's the anxiety that's getting in the way. And as we've said, avoidance is habit forming. So for somebody who, has a fear that's like, you don't like spiders, for example, it's an easy anxiety focus. We know in North America that's not a real fear because it's not a real danger. Our spiders can't really usually kill us. But it's also pretty easy to go about your life if you have a spider phobia. But if you have the kind of anxiety that's focused around not wanting to walk past people in the hallway, go into a room where people are already present, like a classroom, that becomes a huge barrier. Reassurance seeking, I think, is one of the most annoying to parents as an expression of anxiety in children. And that is just quite simply, are you sure you're going to be there? Are you really going to be there to pick me up? You said you'd be there. Are you going to be there? And are you sure there's no surprise snap test tomorrow? Are you sure, that the kids are going to be nice to me tomorrow? It's that kind of constant needing another person to say, yep, it's going to be okay, you're going to be okay, you're going to be okay. And this is something that starts in childhood for anxious children, but unless we teach them some skills, they will be the kids in university that are phoning home. and saying, is it going to be okay tomorrow? I've studied really hard. Do you think I've studied hard enough? And the parent is thinking, I'm not even there. I don't know whether you've studied hard enough. I don't know anything about the course, but I'm saying it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay, right? So we need to teach those skills to cope with that fear. So anxiety in the classroom and also anxiety at home, it's important to know that for teachers are always watching this as well, and they're really good at picking up when likely this child isn't perennially sick to their stomach because there's an ailment, but because there's anxiety that's happening. But the other thing we see at school and also at home is that anxious kids can be very irritable and angry. So I think if you've never seen an anxious child or tried to parent an anxious child or never been anxious yourself to a severe level, you don't realize that this can come out as being really lashing out, temper tantrum, melting down, when somebody is trying to encourage that child to do something that's anxiety provoking. So they might just literally freeze, but they also might yell and hit and get quite belligerent with family members. So here are the key lessons we've learned so far that we have to teach our kids. Anxiety is normal. Everybody feels anxious at some point in time. It's not dangerous. No one's ever died from being anxious. It's sometimes the right thing to feel in a certain situation. And while you're doing this, you need to make sure that you're not minimizing their feelings. So we probably all in our families have somebody. In my case, it was for my kids. We had a woman who looked after them who was the nicest person in the world, but she was old school. And so if the kids were experiencing a feeling that she didn't like, she would just say, no, you don't. You don't have that feeling. You're not feeling that way. So it didn't work very well. But it certainly, usually when we hear ourselves thinking, don't be silly, it's not a big deal, you've done it before, that kind of response is genuine because you're probably pretty fed up as a parent, but it isn't going to help your child to get over that anxiety. In fact, they're probably more likely to ramp up and protest more. The other thing to teach your child about is about avoidance. So if you've taught them about anxiety, you also have to teach them that the thing we know is if you avoid, the anxiety gets bigger. So we're going to work on not avoiding the things that are really anxiety provoking for you. So this is the vicious cycle of avoidance. It's Oreen Wagner's model. She talks about riding the worry hill. So we know that as soon as the anxious person is exposed to or knows they're just about to be exposed to the thing that really makes them feel anxious, their anxiety starts climbing until at the very top they can feel like they're about to fall apart, that their brains are about to explode. And then once they avoid it, so if you look at that purple pattern, avoiding it means that they just don't even learn how to cope with it. So we talk about habituation with anxiety, and it's because of the biology of anxiety. If you sit in an anxious situation long enough, your system stops being anxious. It just has to. It's a biological cycle. So the therapy capitalizes on that. So I would say as a simple example, for me with my flight phobia, the worst flights for me are the little puddle jumper flights. And it isn't so much that they're more bumpy, it's that I'm barely in the plane until I'm on the ground again. And I haven't had time for my anxiety to go down. If I'm thinking of flying a big long distance, I know I'm going to be really anxious, anticipatory, in the airport, and my husband's going to want to drown me because I'm not going to make any sense and I'm going to be irritable. And then once we're up in the air for a while at 34,000 feet, I can feel I just can't keep staying that anxious. So I start to habituate and I'm okay. And then I practice some of my coping skills because we might hit turbulence and then it'll happen again. So that's what we're talking about with our kids. So if you have a kid that doesn't want to go to school because there might be a new teacher, and they're anxious, and Sunday night is horrible, and then you get up Monday morning and they're still not functioning well, and you're tired, and you say, oh, the heck with it, just don't go to school today, then they haven't had an opportunity to habituate to that anxiety, and then you're going to be right back at it again the next day. So if you've ever been in therapy for anxiety, we talk about exposure response prevention. So that means you're exposed to some anxiety, you practice the tools you've been working on to cope with the anxiety, and you don't get to escape. So that's it, exposure response prevention. And then practice makes perfect. So what happens in that model is the more practice you have, the lower your anxiety is. So that while at the beginning you might feel like you're chugging up this hill, gradually over time as you practice, the level of anxiety descends and you can really just coast on that hill. And she has all sorts of little tools that kids can use that help them to kind of keep that in their brains visually. So this is one of her things. You're riding the worry hill. You rename the thought, which means you're changing the worry thought. You're insisting that you're the one that's in charge, not the anxiety. You're defying the anxiety, doing its opposite of what it wants you to do. And then you reward yourself. And it's important, like every parenting situation, you have to reward. The other thing that you do is you don't plunk the person into the most anxiety-provoking situation first. So in the days when I was first being trained, and it's a long time ago, so probably 35 years ago, was the days of what used to be called implosive therapy for anxiety. So you would just basically plunk the person in their worst case scenario. And there's old videos online of people who were afraid of snakes, and they would just drape snakes all over them and make them sit with the snakes until I think they were probably losing their marbles. But now we know that if you do that to somebody, they're going to have a reverberating response of more anxiety for a variety of reasons. One, they didn't have any coping strategies, so they didn't know how to manage their anxiety. And two, they have no trust in the situation in the future because they felt no control. And anxiety is a disorder that really pushes control buttons for people. They need to feel like, I'm in charge, right? So it is important to help our kids understand what are the triggers for your anxiety? What are the situations that make you anxious and how come? What happens in your body when you're anxious? So you're teaching your child to correctly label the anxiety. And that's a biggie, right? So they're no longer thinking they have stomach flu. They're knowing I'm getting anxious because there might be a test and I can feel my stomach going. With little kids, you can do that through like drawing an outline of their body and having them color in the areas of their body where the anxiety happens. The other thing that they talk about doing in the field is kind of labeling the anxiety. One of the things that we've learned is strong emotions in kids that are common for them to experience can start becoming part of who they think they are. So, and you don't want that to happen. So in the same way that if you have a child that has a ready temper response, that gets angry easily, you don't want them to just think they're all about being bad, right? I'm a bad-tempered kid. I'm a bad kid. You teach them that they have a problem, that their temper reacts, and there are things they can do. It's not they're not only their temper. In the same way, we don't want your anxious child, the child that experiences anxiety, to think, well, I'm just all about my anxiety, so I can't do anything. So one of the things you need to do is once your child has said, here's a couple of things that are really, really hard for me at school, say, these are the reasons why I don't want to go to school, this is what makes me anxious. Then you need to start thinking about, okay, how can we start tackling that problem? And one of the things that's really helpful is to have the child help you to come up with what it would be. And you're kind of talking about breaking that scary situation down into steps so they can master each step along the way and practice their skills to manage their anxiety while they're doing it so that they kind of gradually move up to the most difficult situation. And if you ask them to think about how would they give advice to another child, kids are usually very good about coming up with ideas about how their friend could tackle something that's bothering them. So that's another way of getting them to come on board with you. So how would you help your friend if they were afraid of going to the pool? How would you help your friend if they couldn't do sleepovers? What would you suggest would be helpful? And then incorporating those ideas, because they're obviously the things that they would like to use for themselves. So, a common one is not being able to sleep in your own bed. and making it through the night. And as parents, we all start out knowing with infants that we're going to have disrupted sleep. But when kids get to be 7 and 8 and 9, parents start to get pretty fatigued by the constant nightly carousel of visitors to their bed. So helping the child understand what's the hardest part about that process and breaking it down into steps. And making sure that none of the steps forward are too big for the child to manage, because we know if you flood the person with anxiety, then they take about 4 steps backwards. So you got to do it slowly. And you reward, reward, reward. So the important thing to realize is that they're doing something that's really hard, and therefore they need to get rewarded for tackling it. So it's not bribing them, no words about how everybody else can do this, why should I have to give you a reward? That's not going to be helpful. Remembering that your child has a biology that's making their feelings more intense in that situation, it's legitimate, and you're working on a hard task with them. So when they make those steps, they need to pat themselves on the back. There needs to be a celebration, and they need to get a reward. I can give you an example. I think I did many things well as a parent, but I didn't do really well at sleep and at sleeping separate. So we always had a crib and no one ever used it, except sometimes the cat, I think. But nobody ever went in the crib. And at a certain point, I was getting awful sick of it. So by that point in time, my oldest child was 7. So you could have like a good conversation with her about what the heck was going on. And so we set up a system of practicing relaxation, listening to music in bed, doing relaxation, doing visualizations to take her to her favorite place. And then gradually I withdrew from that bedroom. And I'm sure if you'd taken time-lapse photography of us doing it, I would have looked like a lunatic fringe, because I started lying on the bed, then I started lying on the floor with my hand on the bed, then I was lying on the floor but I couldn't touch the bed because I was that much further away, till gradually I moved my way out the door, and then I was in the hallway for a period of time. And we had to do it week by week because daily was too fast and it precipitated us backwards again. I used to go into work and talk to the psychiatrist like, I think I need medication, I'm going out of my mind. And she loved puppies in your pockets. Thank God they existed because they were cheap and they were good rewards. But we had to do it in steps. So she had to have practiced ways of handling her anxiety really well. And we had to do that together until she felt she could really manage it. And we didn't move past each stage of that journey until she felt like her level of anxiety when I was there was low enough that she could manage it on her own. So it takes a tremendous amount of patience, but it pays off. Because for me, what it meant was that after, I can't remember how many months, she wasn't coming into my bed anymore, which was good because I had the other one that I now had to start doing the same process for. But it went quicker for him because I think he watched what happened. So I've mentioned them. So you got to teach these strategies. Learning to relax, challenging your scary thoughts, and facing your fears. So the learning to relax part is really easy with little kids, actually, because they have such terrific imaginations. And so we would do things like, when we did the relaxation exercises, we would visualize that there was a balloon attached to her belly button, actually. And when she would breathe in, she was filling up the balloon with all of her stresses and all of her worries, and then when she would breathe out, the air would fall out of the balloon and the worries would go with it. So you can come up with whatever it is that works for your child, but you need to practice it together, and you need to practice it in a situation in which they're already calm. So we practiced that relaxation for quite some time before we started tackling that fear process, because if you don't have the strategy, you have no way of coping. You also have to think about what they're telling themselves, and usually it's things like, I can't do it. I'm not going to be able to do it. I can't do this by myself. It's too big for me, those kinds of things. So you have to practice reminding the child of the things they've been capable of doing, and therefore what kinds of positive things can they say to themselves that will remind themselves they can tackle it. So there are some other helpful tips. If you have an anxious child, you're going to have a couple of things operating. One, you're probably more likely to be anxious yourself. And if you weren't already, you might catch it because it's exhausting. But you're probably more likely to be biologically predisposed to be anxious. So when they're anxious, you can get triggered, and you have to learn how to manage your own anxiety. Another reason why it's good to practice that relaxation with your child, because I certainly found that was helpful for me. I got a lot better at relaxing in the evening. But you also need to look at reducing general stress in your household, because anxious people are really reactive to stress. We're super sensitive, and it's a strength in many ways because it makes us good with people, but it means that if there's tension, if there's stress, your anxious child is going to pick up that undercurrent, even if nobody is actually overtly fighting. So thinking about ways of reducing stress in your home is a good idea. That means that you take 5 minutes a day to do something goofy together. You carve out some kind of way of making meal times, at least some of the time, positive. I know we all run around like crazy, but you try and have some period of time during the day where you can all calmly come together. You could try and think about talking about something you enjoyed in your day. I think we all tend to be frantic in our days, and then come frantically into our homes, and then frantically try and get homework done, the meal on the table, some other activity, and go to bed. And so if you're a hypersensitive temperament child, that just doesn't work very well. So what ends up happening is your brain is swirling, and then somebody expects you to go to sleep. And you can't go to sleep. And then you start chewing things over and worrying, and away you go. So needing to really look at how you can make that happen. When I was parenting a young anxious child, I wasn't very good at recognizing that, and they were competitive swimmers, and we were running all over the hills half acre. And I can look back on situations where I thought, holy doodle, if I could have just slowed the boat down, we'd have been a lot better off. And I'm not going to share my dreadful memories of some of the things that I, in my franticness, was racing people through. But the next door neighbor had a same age child to the very day as my son. And he was really a sensitive temperament child. And they just took a totally different approach. They prepared him for things that were coming up better than I did, I think. They tended to carve off space each day for him to just slow down. And I look back on it now and I think it was really smart. At the time I was thinking, why isn't he swimming? Like, we're all running around taking lessons. Get your kid out the door. But I think really that was a smart move for him. And it certainly hasn't meant that he didn't, go to university, get a really good job and have a family. So it obviously meant that she, not having had those lessons didn't make a big difference. So routines are important for us anxious type people. And that means just kind of predictability. I don't mean insane routine so that, you're in trouble with your child if you had to vary that routine a little bit. But things to be predictable, and that way the child kind of can hang their hat on it. That means planning ahead, and that's what I was just talking about. So the other thing you're teaching your child to do in planning ahead is teaching them a core problem-solving skill, which doesn't come naturally to anxious people because we tend to catastrophize right away, right? So I can always come up with examples for me, but I can go very automatically to, I can't do it, I'll never get it done, there's too much stuff, where will I begin? All that kind of catastrophizing thinking. If you've started out with your child, and school gives us lots of opportunities for that because there's assignments and things that have to get done, if you've set up a routine, if you've helped them to understand, okay, what's the first thing you have to do? Okay, that's great, you got that done tonight, tick. It gives them skills to be able to remember, okay, I got to break this down into parts, right? And that breaking a task into parts skill is great for anxious people in all sorts of situations. So if you're anxious to approach a social situation, you can say, okay, what are all the parts of what I've got to do, right? And how can I break it down? And then how can I make each part easier? Right? So tonight it was anxiety-provoking for me to come into a room with a bunch of strangers. I see familiar faces. I start there, right? So that you kind of ground yourself and you feel safer and you can move forward. So those are skills that you can generalize. The other thing is to encourage independence. So it's very easy to start wanting, I have to to check my watch so I don't overtalk. It's very easy to start wanting to make your life simpler by just doing things for your kids. And in the short run, it makes it easier. In the long run, it makes it really not a good idea. So, like every single parenting thing we do, it requires thinking about it, planning it, and working on it. And so very important to give them responsibilities in your home, to give them responsibilities age appropriately in relation to people outside the family. So maybe they're the person that does the talking to the store clerk when you go in to get something and you're asking for information. Maybe they're the person that phones the pizza place on Friday night and orders the pizza. Because if you're a socially anxious person, if you don't have practice doing those little bite-sized bits of social interaction with strangers in a safe situation, you can end up being some of the teenagers that we work with who quite simply can't ride a bus because they couldn't ask a bus driver, where should I get off the bus? They're too frightened to do it. So thinking all the time about encouraging independence and stopping excessive reassurance provision. So you praise positive behavior, you praise steps where you see your child's using some of those skills you're practicing, you praise that up the wazoo. But when the young person is asking you repeatedly to be reassured, that becomes a task you have to tackle with them. And there are some strategies that are really clearly outlined on Anxiety BC that will help you to do that, because this is really, really, really common with anxious people, this need to be reassured that the bad thing isn't going to happen, or you're not a bad person, or you did it right. So one of the things you do is you use your principles. So you talk about that problem when it's not happening. So when everybody's calm, when nobody's had a stressor in the immediate, so you're not going to get as vigorous a response, the person won't feel overwhelmed. And then you start to talk about how they can use some of those strategies that you've already taught them to manage anxiety in order to calm themselves down and not have to ask you for reassurance. So it might be that they always have to ask you for reassurance about a test. So you're not starting on that one. But if they sometimes ask you for reassurance about whether or not the teacher likes them, that might be a place to start. Because you can be pretty confident that the teacher isn't being a bully to them in class, and that probably your anxious child is somebody the teacher doesn't mind having in the class. So choose an easy reassurance-seeking starting point and have them start to practice some of their skills. Remember what Oreen Wagner said was change it up. So even if they ultimately ask you for reassurance on that topic, maybe they only ask you once, and then they have to go away and practice their relaxation. Maybe they have to wait 10 minutes before they ask you. So it's just breaking habit response. The same way you might do it yourself if you were quitting smoking and it's driving you bonkers. If you know that after you've had your coffee, you'll always have a cigarette, then you wait. You have that coffee and you wait half an hour before you let yourself have the cigarette. It's the same idea with anxiety habit responses. So this is just an example of a coping toolkit. And we've talked about a lot of the components. So the relaxation training, the visualization I talked about, the example was the balloon, but I know one of the ones that we used a lot had us thinking about your favorite place. And it was two different things for my kids. For my daughter, it was she just saw herself in a field and there was a horse and it was chewing grass and there were birds. And so you're visualizing a very calm, relaxing place, and you help the child to embellish it. So think of the senses, 5 senses. You got to cover all those things because they're going to use that to distract their brain when they start feeling anxious. Then the other thing is to look at whether or not you can come up with some little reminders that they can cope. So they can be a variety of things. They can be little cards with a message on them that you guys have worked out that reminds them of their own strength. I can do it, I've done it before, this will be okay, those kinds of messages. A lot better to be saying those things to yourself than the catastrophizing things anxious kids say. You can also have some kind of something that's a reminder, right? So I used to you can get them at lots of card stores, those little tiny pewter things. We had pewter frogs, I remember, because we liked frogs. And if you put a pewter frog in your pocket and you're approaching an anxious thing, all you have to do is touch your pockets, you remember. Kids are really good about that. So it's like, I remember Dad and I practiced this last night. This is what I've got to remember to do in this situation. And then this is an example of a coping card for class or for school. So it's remember to use RIDE. That's for kids that have gone through that process, right? Be realistic. Don't go overboard. Remember, mistakes are normal. A lot of anxious people are perfectionists. I'm learning to manage my anxiety. I can use my self-talk. I'm more experienced with managing my thoughts now. If I need a break, I can ask the teacher. So those are all statements that don't ignore the problem. They don't say it isn't going to happen. That doesn't work. But they remind the person of what they've learned to do that's more effective now. This is just another little example. The fear thermometer is a good tool to teach kids because it teaches them that anxiety isn't all one level. So you're not always 150% terrified when you're anxious. Some situations might be a 1 or a 2, and you can manage those, and you don't even probably need to do any of your skills to manage those. Ones that are approaching 6 and 7, you better haul out some of your skills because you're going to need them before it goes any higher. You need to act. So last, as I said at the beginning, anxious kids come from anxious families. So oftentimes that's in your best interest because you can think about some of the anxious thoughts you say to yourself, right? And then you can kind of talk aloud to your child. So I think sometimes what we do as parents when we're stressed out is we know we shouldn't talk about our stress to our child because we might stress the child out. And we try really hard not to have, to get irritated and be snappy. But what we might end up doing is just looking really tense. And the child's trying to figure out what's going on, especially if you have an anxious child. So better, you should say, holy cow, I've had a day to end all days, and I'm feeling X. And this is what I think I need to try and say to myself to calm myself down. And this is the kind of thing I think I might need to do now to kind of calm myself down. So it's modeling that you go through the same things as them, but it's normal to have to think about that process and do something about it. Because anxious kids usually think they're the only people that feel that crazy. So it's really important for you to tell them it's normal by showing how you're managing it yourself. This just is a good example, and you can find it on Anxiety BC, of how to teach that thoughts, feelings, behaviors connection to anxious kids. So anxious thoughts, I'm going to fail that test today for sure. Lead to anxious feelings, scared, worried, tense. Lead to anxious behavior. Get angry, blow up if you try and make the child go to school because they want to avoid. So that is really simple for kids to understand once you've practiced it a bit. So then you talk to them about how they can think about it differently with that test. I studied. I know lots of information. It's just a test. I've done well on other tests. That leads to calmer feelings because it's given it a balance. And it leads to coping behavior. You can go to school and do the test. The other thing I would say to you parents of anxious kids is work really hard, not to, because you're probably anxious, to get caught up in believing their anxiety. That can become a really tricky thing not to do. Because you hear those messages of people are picking on me, somebody doesn't like me, it's going to be a disaster, I did a really bad job, I probably was the worst person. It can trigger your own anxiety. It's an opportunity for you to be able to say, boy, I can hear my own anxiety going. I'm listening to you and I can just feel myself revving up and being anxious. Here's what I think we need to do. All right? It's been a pleasure.